The cruelest wounds are not those inflicted by enemies, for such injuries arrive expected and can be defended against, with walls built high and vigilance maintained. No, the cruelest wounds are those delivered by the very hearts one trusted, by hands one reached for in the darkness, by lips that whispered promises they never intended to keep. Lady Arabella Thornwood understood this truth with the particular clarity that only devastation can provide, for she had learned it not from books or cautionary tales shared by well-meaning mammas, but from lived experience that carved itself into her memory with the precision of a master engraver's tool. 2 years had passed since the Devonshire ball, yet she could still recall every excruciating detail of that evening, the way the chandeliers had cast their golden light across the assembled guests, the delicate strains of the orchestra filling the perfumed air, the rustle of silk and satin as dancers moved through their elegant formations, and the absolute certainty she had carried in her young heart that Lord Marcus Ashworth would finally make their understanding official. They had courted for a full year, after all, a year of meaningful glances across crowded rooms, of stolen conversations in moonlit gardens, of his hand lingering upon hers during dances, and his voice dropping to intimate registers when he spoke of their future. She had been 21 then, the daughter of a viscount, with a respectable, if not extraordinary dowry, possessed of what society deemed pleasing features, honey-coloured hair that caught the light prettily, eyes the soft grey of morning mist, a figure neither too slender nor too full, and she had believed, with all the tender foolishness of first love, that Marcus cherished her. The announcement came without warning, his voice carrying across the ballroom with deliberate projection as he declared his engagement to Lady Portia Sinclair, whose fortune exceeded Arabella's by some £40,000, and whose connections reached into the highest circles of the aristocracy. Arabella had stood mere feet away, close enough to see the satisfied curve of Lady Portia's painted lips, close enough to watch Marcus's eyes slide past her own as if she were a stranger, as if every whispered promise had been nothing more than idle amusement to pass the time until a worthier prospect appeared. The pitying glances had been almost worse than the betrayal itself, the way fans fluttered before whispering mouths, the way dowagers shook their heads with knowing sympathy, the way her own mother's face had crumpled with shared humiliation before she gathered herself and guided Arabella from the room with desperate dignity. In the days and weeks that followed, society rendered its verdict with ruthless efficiency. Lady Arabella Thornwood had aimed above her station, had presumed too much, had been taught a valuable lesson about the realities of the marriage market. She retreated from London before the season ended, returned to her family's modest estate in Hampshire, and resolved never again to subject herself to such vulnerable hoping. Now, at 23, she was considered firmly upon the shelf, a spinster in the making, and she had cultivated a careful acceptance of this fate that she wore like armor against a world that had proven itself unworthy of her trust. Thornwood Hall had once been considered a jewel of Hampshire, its Georgian facade elegant in its symmetry, its grounds a testament to generations of careful cultivation, but time and circumstance had dimmed its luster in ways that Arabella felt keenly each morning when she rose to face another day of quiet management and quieter resignation. The roof above the east wing leaked when autumn rains arrived, and the funds to repair it properly had long since been redirected toward more pressing concerns, her father's gambling debts, which mounted with each passing quarter like snow accumulating upon a mountainside, threatening at any moment to cascade into an avalanche that would bury them all. She did not speak of these worries to her mother, whose health had declined steadily since the humiliation of the Devonshire ball, as if the shame of watching her eldest daughter's prospects crumble had settled into Lady Thornwood's very bones and refused to depart. Instead, Arabella tended to the household accounts with meticulous care, stretching every pound until it groaned beneath the strain, dismissing servants they could no longer afford with letters of recommendation that praised their service effusively, and maintaining the appearance of genteel comfort even as the reality grew increasingly threadbare. Her days followed a rhythm she had cultivated deliberately, finding purpose in the small tasks that spinsters were permitted to claim as their domain. She read aloud to her mother in the afternoons, her voice steady and soothing over passages from novels that promised happy endings she no longer believed in. She organized the household linens with precision that bordered upon obsession. She walked the grounds each morning, finding solace in the golden light of autumn, filtering through leaves that blazed crimson and amber before their inevitable fall. Her younger sister Catherine, 17 and blooming with the particular radiance of a girl approaching her debut season, provided both joy and anxiety in equal measure. Joy because Catherine's laughter still rang genuine through the halls, unmarked by the cynicism that had become Arabella's constant companion, and anxiety because a proper debut required funds they did not possess, a dowry that existed only in increasingly desperate imagination, and connections that Arabella's disgrace had severed with surgical finality. She had armored her heart with practical contentment, she told herself, had chosen the quiet dignity of useful spinsterhood over the vulnerable, hoping that had once led her to believe a man's whispered promises. Books became her companions, their pages offering worlds where she need not guard herself against disappointment. Charitable works among the village poor provided purpose that required nothing from her heart beyond simple human kindness, and caring for her family gave her days meaning that did not depend upon the fickle regard of society or the treacherous terrain of romantic attachment. Yet sometimes, in the golden stillness of autumn evenings when the light slanted just so through the drawing-room windows, Arabella caught herself gazing toward the horizon with something that felt dangerously close to longing, and she would turn away sharply, reminding herself that hope was a luxury she could no longer afford, not when creditors' letters arrived with increasing frequency, not when her mother's cough worsened with each passing week, not when the future stretched before her as predictable and narrow as the lane leading from Thornwood Hall to the village church where she would likely worship, unmarried and unremarkable, until she was laid to rest in the family plot beside ancestors who had expected far better for their descendants. Society spoke of Sebastian Blackwood, Duke of Ashworth, in hushed tones that carried equal measures of fascination and trepidation, for he was a man who seemed to exist outside the ordinary rules that governed the ton's glittering world, impossibly wealthy, formidably powerful, and utterly indifferent to the matrimonial machinations that consumed every season's worth of ambitious mammas and their hopeful daughters. At 32, he remained unwed despite being considered the most eligible prize in all of England, his continued bachelorhood a source of endless speculation in drawing-rooms from London to the furthest country estates. Some whispered that his heart had been carved from the same cold stone as his ancestral seat. Others suggested darker reasons for his disinterest in feminine company. Still others maintained he was simply too proud, too exacting in his standards, to settle for any woman who did not meet requirements so impossibly high they might as well be written in the stars. What all agreed upon was his severity, the way he never smiled at balls, the cutting precision with which he dismissed simpering debutantes who attempted to catch his eye, the reputation for fairness in his business dealings that was matched only by his reputation for brooking no foolishness whatsoever. Arabella had heard these whispers, of course, had observed him from careful distance during her single disastrous season, had noted the way crowds seemed to part before him, and conversations stuttered into silence when he approached, but she had never imagined any circumstance that might bring such a man into her orbit, much less into her father's modest study on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, when autumn light slanted through windows that needed cleaning, and the fire in the grate struggled against encroaching dampness. The summons had come without explanation, simply her father's voice, strained and peculiar, requesting her presence at her earliest convenience, and Arabella had descended the stairs with the particular wariness that had become second nature since their fortunes began their precipitous decline, expecting perhaps another conversation about economizing, another painful discussion of what possessions might be sold without attracting undue notice. What she had not expected was the man who rose from the worn leather chair as she entered, his height commanding in the small space, his dark hair swept back from a face that might have been carved by a sculptor tasked with rendering aristocratic severity in its purest form, his eyes grey as winter storms, grey as her own, but infinitely more penetrating, fixing upon her with an expression she could not begin to decipher. Her father stood near the window, his posture communicating a strange mixture of relief and anxiety that set Arabella's nerves humming with alarm, and when he spoke the introduction, his voice carried a weight that suggested this was no ordinary social call. "Arabella, may I present His Grace, the Duke of Ashworth, who has requested a private audience with our family." The Duke inclined his head with formal precision, and Arabella dropped into a curtsy that felt woefully inadequate to the situation, her mind racing through possibilities and finding none that made sense, none that explained why the most powerful unmarried man in England should find himself in their faded drawing-room, regarding her with those unreadable eyes that seemed to see through every carefully constructed defense she had built against a world that had already proven itself capable of devastating cruelty. The Duke did not resume his seat but remained standing, a commanding presence that seemed to diminish the proportions of the study around him, and when he spoke, his voice carried the precise, measured cadence of a man accustomed to conducting negotiations where ambiguity could prove costly. "I shall speak plainly, Lady Arabella, for I have little patience for the circuitous manner in which such matters are typically conducted, and I suspect you share that preference for directness," he began, his grey gaze holding hers with an intensity that made her want to look away and yet rendered her incapable of doing so. "I find myself in need of a wife, not from any romantic inclination, I assure you, but from practical necessity that I shall not insult your intelligence by obscuring. My grandmother, the Dowager Duchess, is unwell, and her dearest wish before departing this world is to see me settled with a suitable partner and the succession secured. I have resisted matrimony for reasons of my own, but I find I cannot deny her this final comfort, and so I have undertaken to identify a bride who might suit my particular requirements." Arabella's heart hammered against her ribs, confusion and disbelief warring for dominance, as she struggled to comprehend why this speech was being delivered to her. Of all the eligible women in England, she who possessed neither fortune nor unblemished reputation, she who had been relegated to society's margins with decisive finality, the Duke continued, seemingly unaware of or indifferent to her mounting bewilderment. "I have observed you, Lady Arabella, though you may not have been aware of my attention. I watched how you conducted yourself during what must have been an excruciating ordeal. 2 seasons passed with dignity that never faltered into bitterness, with grace that asked nothing from those who offered only pity. I made inquiries and learned of your intelligence, your capability in managing a household under trying circumstances, your complete absence of the fortune-hunting desperation that renders so many young women tedious beyond endurance." He paused, and something shifted almost imperceptibly in his stern expression, softening the granite edges into something nearly human. "What I propose is an arrangement of mutual benefit, marriage, which would satisfy my grandmother's wishes and eventually provide an heir to the dukedom. In exchange, your family's debts would be settled in their entirety. Your sister would receive a dowry befitting the sister-in-law of a duke, and your parents would be assured comfort for the remainder of their days. The terms would be generous, and should you find, after obligations are fulfilled, that you prefer to live separately, such arrangements can be made with full maintenance of your position and dignity." The silence that followed his pronouncement seemed to press against Arabella's ears, thick and absolute, as she grasped for words that refused to form. Finally, her voice emerged smaller than she intended. "Your Grace, I am. I confess myself utterly at a loss. Why me, specifically, when you might have any woman in England?" The Duke's answer came without hesitation, as if he had anticipated and prepared for precisely this question. "Because I have no tolerance for romantic pretense, Lady Arabella, and I value honesty above all other qualities in a potential partner. Your conduct during your exile from society's good graces demonstrated both traits in abundance. You did not dissemble, did not scheme, did not attempt to manipulate your way back into favor through artifice. You simply endured, with a quiet strength I find far more admirable than any accomplishment taught in finishing schools. I do not offer you love, for I am not certain I possess the capacity for such sentiment, but I offer you security, respect, and a partnership built upon truth rather than illusion." The night passed in fitful fragments of sleep, Arabella's mind turning the Duke's proposition over and over like a worry stone, examining each facet until the edges grew smooth, with repetition yet no clearer in their implications, and when dawn's pale light crept through her chamber curtains, she rose with a certainty that had crystallized somewhere in the small hours, a certainty that she must speak with him again, must make him understand what he was offering to bind himself to, before the matter proceeded any further. She sent a note requesting an audience at his earliest convenience, her handwriting steadier than her pulse, and when word came that His Grace would receive her in the morning room at 10 o'clock, she dressed with care that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with armor, selecting a gown of deep grey that matched her mood and her eyes, simple and unadorned, the costume of a woman who had abandoned pretense along with hope. He was standing by the window when she entered, silhouetted against the autumn light, and he turned at her approach with that same unreadable expression she was beginning to recognize as his default presentation to the world. A mask so practiced it might have been mistaken for his true face by anyone who did not look closely enough to notice the subtle tensions beneath. "Lady Arabella," he acknowledged, gesturing toward a chair, but she remained standing, needing the dignity of height even though he towered above her still, needing to deliver what she had come to say from a position of what little strength she could muster. "Your Grace, I must beg you, please, do not marry me." The words emerged more desperately than she had intended, stripped of the careful phrasing she had rehearsed, and she watched something flicker across his features before the mask reasserted itself. "I am damaged goods in the eyes of society," she continued, the confession pouring forth now like water through a breached dam, "and while you may not care for society's opinion, your family name, your position, your future children, all will bear the stain of association with a woman who was publicly discarded, publicly humiliated, publicly deemed unworthy. There will be whispers questioning your judgment, speculation about what desperation drove you to such a choice, gossip that will follow us both into every ballroom and drawing room for years to come." She drew a breath that shook, despite her best efforts to steady it. "And beyond the practical considerations, Your Grace, there is a truth I must confess. I cannot offer you my heart. It was broken 2 years ago, broken so thoroughly that I am not certain the pieces could ever be reassembled into anything resembling wholeness. You spoke of partnership, of honesty, and so I am being honest now. I am capable of duty, of respect, of managing your household with competence. But love?" She shook her head, feeling the sting of tears she refused to shed. "I do not believe I am capable of love any longer. Whatever capacity I possessed for such feeling was destroyed on the night Marcus announced his engagement to another, while I stood close enough to see the satisfaction in his eyes. You deserve a wife who can offer you genuine affection, who can warm your home with feeling rather than mere function, who can—" Her voice cracked, and she forced it steady again through sheer will. "You deserve someone whole, Your Grace, someone undamaged, someone who can love you properly, if love is ever something you desire. I am not that woman, and I fear I never shall be again. Please, I beg you, withdraw your offer while you still can do so without obligation, and find yourself a bride worthy of all you offer." The silence stretched between them, taut as a bowstring, and Arabella braced herself for the words she was certain would follow: the polite gratitude for her honesty, the graceful acceptance of the escape she had offered him, the formal bow and departure that would end this strange interlude and return her life to its quiet, colorless predictability. But the Duke did not speak those words, did not move toward the door, did not show any sign of the relief she had expected to see transform his stern features into something approaching warmth at his narrow escape from a disastrous alliance. Instead, he regarded her with an expression that seemed to shift and deepen as she watched, the granite of his gaze softening into something almost wondering, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a quality she had not heard in it before, something raw beneath the careful formality, something that spoke of depths she had not imagined existed beneath his impeccable surface. "Lady Arabella," he said slowly, as if weighing each word before releasing it, "do you understand what you have just done? You stand before me with nothing, no fortune, no unblemished reputation, no leverage of any kind, and I have offered you everything: security, position, the salvation of your entire family. By every rule of rational self-interest, you should be accepting my proposal with whatever gratitude you can muster, and praying I do not change my mind. Instead, you beg me to reconsider, warn me of consequences to my reputation, confess what you perceive as your inadequacies, and urge me to find someone more worthy." He paused, and something flickered in his grey eyes, something that might have been admiration, or recognition, or a pain so old it had become indistinguishable from the man who carried it. Precisely this is why I chose you, your concern for my welfare, when you stand to gain everything from this arrangement and lose nothing by allowing it to proceed, tells me more about your character than 100 ballroom conversations or 1,000 letters of recommendation ever could. He moved then, not toward the door but toward her, closing the distance between them until she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the slight tension in his jaw that spoke of emotions held under strict governance, and she found she could not retreat, could not look away, could only stand rooted to the carpet as he continued in that same measured tone that somehow conveyed more feeling than any passionate declaration might have done. "You speak of being damaged, Lady Arabella, as if damage were a disqualification rather than a universal condition of having lived and felt and trusted unwisely. I do not require your love, I told you as much, and I meant it. What I require is your honesty, which you have demonstrated in abundance, your dignity, which you wear like armor, and which I find infinitely more attractive than the simpering compliance society breeds into its young women, your partnership, freely given, in building something that serves us both." His voice dropped lower, and she saw something flicker across his features, a shadow of old grief, quickly suppressed, but not quickly enough to escape her notice entirely. "Perhaps we are both damaged in ways that might make us suited to one another," he said quietly, almost to himself, and the words hung in the air between them, laden with implications he did not elaborate upon, histories he did not share, wounds that matched her own in ways she could not yet fathom. "I am not rescinding my offer, Lady Arabella. I am giving you 1 week to consider it properly, without the pressure of my presence, and I ask only that you weigh the matter with the same honesty you have shown me today. Whatever you decide, I shall respect absolutely." He bowed then formally, correctly, with none of the warmth his words had almost promised, and departed without looking back, leaving Arabella standing alone in the morning room, with her heart pounding against her ribs and her certainties scattered like autumn leaves in an unexpected wind, grasping for understanding of an encounter that had proceeded nothing like she had anticipated, and a man who, she was beginning to suspect, was nothing like the cold statue society believed him to be. The days that followed the Duke's departure from Thornwood Hall passed in a blur of restless contemplation, Arabella's thoughts circling endlessly around his words, his unexpectedly gentle tone, the shadow of old pain she had glimpsed beneath his composed exterior. And on the 4th evening, her mother summoned her to sit beside her bed, frail fingers reaching for her daughter's hand with surprising strength as she spoke with the quiet wisdom of a woman who had watched her eldest child retreat from life and longed to see her embrace it once more. "My darling girl," her mother said, her voice soft but steady, "I have watched you build walls around your heart these past 2 years, and I have understood why, have ached for the wound that made such fortifications necessary. But I must tell you something I should have said long ago. Surviving is not the same as living, and safety purchased at the cost of every possibility is merely a different kind of prison." She squeezed Arabella's hand with gentle insistence. "This man, this Duke, who sees your worth when you cannot see it yourself, he is offering you a door, not a cage. What you choose to build within that marriage is entirely yours to determine, but refusing to step through the door at all, out of fear of what might lie beyond." She shook her head slowly, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "That is not wisdom, my love. That is fear wearing wisdom's clothing, and you are braver than that, even if you have forgotten it." Those words echoed through Arabella's sleepless nights, intertwining with the memory of Sebastian's voice when he spoke of damage, of partnership, of 2 wounded souls who might find in one another something neither expected. And when the week concluded, and she penned her acceptance with a hand that trembled only slightly, she felt not the resignation she had anticipated, but something stranger, something almost like the first fragile stirrings of hope she had forbidden herself to feel for 2 long years. The wedding was held 3 weeks later in the private chapel at Thornwood Hall, an intimate affair attended only by immediate family and a few close connections, the ancient stone walls softened by arrangements of white roses and flickering candlelight that cast gentle shadows across the carved wooden pews. Arabella wore her late grandmother's pearls against a gown of ivory silk, simple and elegant, her dark hair dressed with small white flowers, and when she walked toward the altar where Sebastian waited, she saw something shift in his grey eyes, something that might have been admiration or approval, or perhaps simply acknowledgement that she had chosen courage over retreat. He spoke his vows with solemn gravity, each word deliberate and weighted with meaning, and when he took her hand to slide the ring onto her finger, his touch was unexpectedly gentle, his fingers warm against her cool skin, and their eyes met in a moment that felt somehow suspended outside of time, private despite the witnesses surrounding them, and in his gaze she saw something that might have been reassurance, a silent promise that whatever lay ahead, she would not face it alone. The wedding breakfast passed in a blur of polite conversation and raised glasses, and then she was in a carriage beside her husband, the word still strange and heavy on her tongue, departing the only home she had ever known for a future she could not begin to imagine. Watching through the window as Thornwood Hall grew smaller in the distance, her old life receding with every turn of the wheels, while ahead of her stretched something vast and unknown, terrifying and oddly, impossibly, touched with the faintest glimmer of light. Blackwood Hall rose from the landscape like something out of ancient legend, its weathered stone walls the color of storm clouds and honey intermingled, towers and parapets reaching toward a sky that seemed somehow vaster here than it had at modest Thornwood. And as the carriage rolled through the imposing iron gates and up the sweeping drive lined with centuries-old oaks, Arabella felt her breath catch at the sheer magnitude of the place that was now, impossibly, her home. The grounds stretched in every direction as far as she could see, manicured lawns giving way to formal gardens, which yielded in turn to parkland dotted with grazing deer, and beyond that, forested hills rolling toward the horizon, like green waves frozen in time, and she understood for the first time the true weight of the title she now bore, the history and responsibility that came with being Duchess of such an estate. Sebastian handed her down from the carriage himself, rather than leaving the task to a footman, his gloved hand steady beneath her fingers, and though his expression remained composed, she thought she detected something almost anxious in the way he watched her face as she took in her surroundings, as if her reaction to his ancestral home mattered to him in ways he would never articulate aloud. The interior proved equally magnificent, soaring ceilings adorned with elaborate plasterwork, galleries lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, drawing rooms appointed with furniture that spoke of generations of accumulated wealth and taste. Yet, as a maid led her to the Duchess's chambers, Arabella began to notice details that seemed incongruous with the formal grandeur surrounding them. Fresh flowers filled a crystal vase on her dressing table, late-blooming roses in shades of cream and palest pink that must have been coaxed from the greenhouse at considerable effort given the advancing season. A fire blazed cheerfully in the marble fireplace, warming chambers that might otherwise have felt cold and imposing, and the heavy velvet curtains had been drawn back to admit the afternoon light in a way that suggested someone had given thought to creating welcome rather than merely preparing a room. But it was the bookshelf beside the window that stopped her breath entirely, a small case, clearly new, filled with volumes she recognized with a start of astonishment, the Gothic novels she had mentioned admiring in passing conversation at the Hartwell Musicale nearly a year ago, a botanical reference she had lingered over at a bookseller's stall during a rare trip to the village, collections of poetry she had quoted to Catherine during those long evenings when they had nothing but words to fill the silence left by their dwindling fortunes. He had noticed, he had remembered, he had arranged, somehow, for these small comforts to await her, and the realization cracked something open in Arabella's chest that she had not known was still capable of breaking. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pembroke, arrived to review the household arrangements, a woman of perhaps 50 years, with kind eyes and a manner that conveyed both efficiency and genuine warmth, and the way she spoke of his grace, the unconscious affection that softened her practical tone whenever she mentioned him, told Arabella more about her husband's true character than any society gossip ever had. That evening, dinner was served in a smaller dining room rather than the cavernous formal hall, the table set for two, with candles casting gentle light across silver and crystal, and Sebastian proved a courteous if reserved companion, inquiring after her comfort, explaining household routines, discussing practical matters of her new position with the same careful attention he might give to estate business. When he walked her to her chamber door afterward, he paused with his hand on the frame, and something in his grey eyes seemed almost uncertain for the first time since she had known him. "I trust you will find everything to your satisfaction," he said quietly. "But if there is anything you require, anything at all that would make Blackwood feel more like home to you, you have only to ask." Then he bowed formally, correctly wished her good night, and departed for his own chambers without any presumption of entry, without any claim upon the intimacies that marriage entitled him to demand. And Arabella lay awake for hours in her magnificent new bed, staring at the canopy above her and trying to reconcile the cold, stern Duke of Society's whispers with the man who had filled her shelves with beloved books and asked nothing of her but her comfort. The first weeks of marriage passed in a rhythm of tentative exploration, each day revealing small truths about the man Arabella had bound herself to in that candlelit chapel, and she found herself watching Sebastian with the careful attention of a naturalist studying some rare and elusive creature, cataloguing his habits and preferences as though assembling a portrait from scattered pieces. He rose before dawn each morning to ride across the estate, returning with colour in his lean cheeks and an energy that seemed to sustain him through the long hours of work that followed, for she quickly discovered that the Duke of Blackwood was no idle aristocrat content to leave his affairs to stewards and solicitors. He reviewed accounts himself, met personally with tenants, walked his lands with the intimate knowledge of a man who understood that privilege carried obligations. The servants, she noticed, moved through their duties without the nervous tension she had observed in other grand houses. They worked with quiet efficiency and genuine respect, speaking of his grace with warmth when they thought themselves unobserved, and such loyalty, Arabella knew, was earned rather than commanded. Each afternoon, Sebastian disappeared for precisely 1 hour to visit his grandmother in her private apartments in the East Wing, and when Arabella tentatively asked if she might accompany him, something shifted in his grey eyes, surprise, perhaps, or a guarded pleasure he did not quite know how to express, and he inclined his head in that formal way of his and said she would be most welcome. The Dowager Duchess proved to be a revelation, sharp-tongued and imperious, with eyes that had lost none of their penetrating intelligence despite her advanced years. She studied Arabella with the frankness of a woman who had long since abandoned social pretense and demanded only honesty from those around her. Their first conversation felt rather like being examined by a particularly exacting governess. Questions fired with precision about Arabella's reading habits, her opinions on estate management, her thoughts on the shocking inadequacy of modern education for young ladies, and through it all Sebastian sat quietly, watching the exchange with an expression Arabella could not quite decipher. When the visit concluded, the Dowager pronounced her verdict with characteristic bluntness. "Sensible girl, not a simpering fool. You'll do." In the carriage returning to the main house, Sebastian's lips curved into what might almost have been a smile, and when Arabella asked what amused him, he explained that his grandmother had dismissed every prospective bride presented to her over the past decade with cutting assessments of their inadequacies, that she had found Arabella sensible constituted, in dowager terms, the highest possible praise. Something warm kindled in Arabella's chest at his words, at the quiet pride beneath his measured tone, and she found herself smiling more freely at dinner that evening, their conversation flowing with an ease that would have seemed impossible mere weeks before. He asked her opinion on a tenant dispute. She offered her thoughts, and he listened, actually listened, with attention that made her feel seen in ways Marcus's flowery compliments never had. These small moments, a question genuinely posed, an answer genuinely considered, began to chip away at walls. Arabella had believed impenetrable, and she retired each night increasingly, uncertain whether the fortress around her heart was protection or prison. The rain had been falling steadily since morning, a grey curtain that transformed the world beyond Blackwood Hall's windows into an impressionist watercolour of greens and silvers, and Arabella found herself wandering the endless corridors with no particular destination in mind, simply exploring the vast house that still revealed new rooms and hidden corners even after weeks of residence, when she heard something unexpected drifting from the library, not the silence she had come to associate with that grand space, nor the quiet rustle of Sebastian reviewing estate papers, but voices, young and bright, punctuated by what sounded remarkably like laughter. She approached the partially open door with quiet footsteps, curiosity overcoming the propriety that might have prompted her to announce herself, and the sight that greeted her through the gap stopped her breath entirely. Sebastian sat in one of the leather chairs near the fireplace, but he had drawn it down from its usual formal position to create an intimate circle with several smaller chairs, clearly borrowed from elsewhere in the house, and arranged around him were perhaps 6 or 7 children of varying ages, tenant children by their simple clothing, their faces turned up toward him with rapt attention as he read aloud from a book of adventure tales, his voice animated in ways she had never heard it, rising and falling with the narrative's drama, occasionally dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that made the youngest listeners lean forward with wide eyes. His severe features had softened into something almost playful, When one small girl interrupted with a question about whether pirates truly existed, he answered with patient gravity, treating her curiosity as worthy of genuine consideration rather than childish nonsense to be dismissed. Arabella must have made some small sound, a shift of her weight, an indrawn breath, because Sebastian's gaze lifted suddenly and found her watching from the doorway, and what she witnessed in that unguarded moment nearly undid her. A flush climbed his sharp cheekbones, the first color she had ever seen embarrassment bring to his face, and something almost vulnerable flickered in his grey eyes before his expression began to reassemble itself into its customary composure. Later, Mrs. Pembroke explained that flooding had rendered the village school unusable for the week, and His Grace had simply announced that lessons would continue in the hall's library until repairs were complete, a declaration that had apparently scandalized no one on staff, for this was simply how the Duke was, though the world beyond Blackwood's gates would never believe it. That evening, Arabella found herself in the estate office, searching for writing paper to send Catherine a letter, when she stumbled upon a ledger that was not meant for her eyes, or perhaps it was, for Sebastian had never forbidden her any room or document, and what she discovered within those meticulously kept pages redrew entirely the portrait she had constructed of her husband. Anonymous donations to a London hospital that treated patients regardless of their ability to pay, substantial annual support for 3 separate orphanages, a quiet pension arranged for the widow of a groom who had served Blackwood Hall for 30 years, school fees paid for the clever children of tenants who showed academic promise. She confronted him that night after dinner, the ledger in her hands, demanding to know why he had hidden such generosity behind his cold facade. Sebastian's expression shuttered, and he dismissed her discovery with a wave of his hand. Mere duty, he said, the basic obligations of his position, nothing worthy of remark. But Arabella understood now what she had failed to see before, that the stern Duke who terrified debutantes and sent fortune hunters fleeing was a carefully constructed fortress, and within those walls lived a man who felt so deeply, cared so profoundly, that he could only express such feelings through deed rather than word, through quiet action rather than proclamation, and the knowing settled into her chest like a key turning in a lock she had not realized existed. Their evenings together became a ritual as autumn deepened into winter, the world beyond Blackwood Hall's windows growing dark and cold, while within its walls a different kind of warmth kindled slowly, like embers catching in a carefully tended hearth. And Arabella found herself anticipating those quiet hours after dinner with an eagerness she dared not examine too closely, for to examine it would be to acknowledge what was growing in the spaces between her carefully maintained defenses. They would retire to the smaller drawing room. Sebastian had explained that the grand formal rooms were for entertaining guests, but this space was for living, where a fire always blazed in the marble hearth, and candles cast pools of golden light across comfortable furniture worn soft by generations of use, and there they would read in companionable silence or engage in conversations that wandered through literature and philosophy, through debates about agricultural reform and discussions of which poets deserved their reputations and which were merely fashionable pretenders. And Arabella discovered that Sebastian possessed a dry wit that emerged only in these unguarded moments, observations so unexpected and precisely aimed that she found herself laughing with genuine delight, a sound that seemed to please him in ways his composed expression barely revealed. He taught her to play chess properly. She had known the basic movements, but had never faced an opponent who treated the game as worthy of serious consideration, and she proved an apt pupil, her strategic mind grasping patterns and possibilities with a quickness that earned one of his rare half-smiles, that slight curve of his lips that transformed the severe planes of his face into something approaching softness. And she began to notice other things too, things she had no business noticing, the way candlelight caught the sharp angle of his jaw, the elegant economy of his movements as he reached across the board, the grace of his long fingers as they lifted a knight or slid a bishop into position, hands that she knew could command vast estates and intimidate powerful men, yet handled a book's pages with surprising gentleness. One evening, they both reached for the same volume, a collection of Byron's works they had been debating earlier, and their fingers brushed against the leather spine, a contact so brief it should have meant nothing, yet heat bloomed beneath Arabella's skin as though she had touched an open flame, spreading from that point of contact through her hand, up her arm, into her chest, where her heart suddenly beat with uncomfortable awareness, and when she looked up, Startled, she found Sebastian watching her with an expression she could not name, something intent and searching in those grey eyes that usually revealed so little, and for a long moment neither of them moved, the book forgotten between them, the fire crackling into a silence that felt weighted with unspoken things. She withdrew her hand first, murmuring something about how he should take it. She had her own copy somewhere. Words that meant nothing, served only to shatter whatever strange spell had descended. And Sebastian accepted the book with a nod that seemed almost reluctant, and they did not speak of the moment afterward, but Arabella caught him watching her several more times. That evening, glances quickly averted when she looked up, a tension in his shoulders that had not been present before, and she recognized with growing alarm that her carefully guarded heart, that fortress she had built from the rubble of Marcus's betrayal, was no longer entirely her own, that Sebastian had somehow found his way past walls she had believed impenetrable, and the knowing terrified her more than any society ballroom ever had. The announcement came on a frost-touched morning in late January, delivered with Sebastian's characteristic directness over breakfast, and Arabella felt her stomach clench into a knot of cold dread even before he finished speaking. His grandmother had insisted, in terms that brooked no argument, that the Duke and his new Duchess must attend the London season, that society must be given proper opportunity to acknowledge the marriage, that whispers and speculation would only flourish in the absence of their presence to contradict them. And while Sebastian's tone suggested he found the entire prospect as appealing as a visit to the tooth drawer, his expression also conveyed that defying the Dowager on this particular matter was not a battle he intended to fight. London, Arabella thought, and the word alone was enough to send ice through her veins. London meant glittering ballrooms filled with the same faces that had witnessed her humiliation, meant whispered conversations behind fans that would fall silent at her approach, meant the inevitable, unavoidable possibility of encountering Lord Marcus Ashworth and his wife, meant returning to the scene of her greatest shame, now wearing a title that would invite scrutiny of the most merciless kind, and she found she could not speak, could not do anything but stare at her untouched toast, while her mind conjured every terrible possibility in vivid, excruciating detail. That evening, after a day spent in distracted misery that she hoped she had successfully concealed, Arabella found herself confessing her fears to Sebastian in the quiet intimacy of their drawing-room, the words spilling out before she could stop them, her terror of facing those who had pitied her, her certainty that society would find her wanting as a duchess, her dread of the whispers that would surely follow her through every gathering, the specific, sharp-edged fear of seeing Marcus again, and feeling once more like that devastated girl in her too hopeful gown. Sebastian listened without interruption, his grey eyes fixed upon her face with an attention that felt almost physical in its intensity, and when she finally fell silent, breathless and embarrassed by her own vulnerability, he said simply, quietly, with a certainty that seemed to arise from somewhere deeper than mere reassurance, "I will be beside you." 3 words, unadorned by flowery promises or elaborate declarations, yet they settled into Arabella's chest like a steadying hand, and she found she could breathe again. The journey to London passed in a blur of winter landscapes and coaching inns, and then suddenly they were arrived at the Blackwood townhouse in Mayfair, a magnificent residence that dwarfed the modest home of Arabella's childhood and announced its owner's consequence in every elegant line of its architecture. The days that followed brought a parade of modistes and milliners, Sebastian having apparently instructed that his duchess was to want for nothing, and Arabella found herself transformed by gowns of silk and velvet in colours she would never have dared choose for herself. Deep emerald that brought out the green in her hazel eyes, rich burgundy that warmed her complexion, delicate gold embroidery that caught the light with her every movement. She looked, when she studied her reflection, like a duchess, like a woman of consequence and beauty, yet beneath the exquisite fabrics and careful coiffures, she remained that wounded girl who had fled London 2 years ago, with her heart in ruins, and as the date of the Worthington Ball approached her first public appearance as the Duchess of Blackwood, Arabella found herself lying awake in her luxurious chambers, rehearsing dignified responses to imagined slights and praying for courage she was not certain she possessed. The Worthington ballroom blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, their flames reflected in crystal chandeliers that hung like frozen waterfalls above a sea of silk and satin, and when Arabella stepped through the grand entrance on Sebastian's arm, The vast chamber fell into a hush so complete she could hear the rustle of her own emerald gown against the marble floor, every eye in that glittering assembly turning to fix upon the Duke of Blackwood and his unexpected Duchess, with an intensity that made her heart pound against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for escape. She felt their gazes like physical weights, the curious, the contemptuous, the merely fascinated, and for one terrible moment her courage nearly failed her, her fingers tightening convulsively on Sebastian's sleeve as 2 years of carefully buried shame threatened to rise up and drown her. But then she felt his hand cover hers, warm and steady and utterly certain, and when she glanced up at his face, she found him surveying the assembled company with an expression of such complete indifference to their judgment that she almost laughed, and something in that aristocratic disdain for society's opinion steadied her own faltering nerve. He guided her forward into the crowd, and if his pace was unhurried, his manner spoke of ownership in every line, not of her. She understood instinctively, but of this moment, of their right to be here, of his absolute refusal to permit anyone to make his Duchess feel unwelcome in any room she chose to grace with her presence. The whispers began almost immediately, a susurration of voices hidden behind fans and gloved hands, but Sebastian led her to the dance floor as the orchestra struck up a waltz, and there, before the watching eyes of everyone who had ever pitied her or dismissed her or whispered about her fall from grace, he drew her into his arms and they danced not once but 3 times, a declaration so pointed that even the most obtuse observer could not mistake its meaning, and by the 3rd dance the whispers had shifted in tone from scandalized speculation to something approaching grudging admiration. They had paused near the refreshment table, Sebastian procuring her a glass of champagne, when a voice she had hoped never to hear again cut through the ambient noise of conversation. "Why, Lady Arabella, I do beg your pardon. Your Grace, what an unexpected pleasure." Lord Marcus Ashworth stood before them, his handsome face arranged in an expression of practiced charm that no longer held any power to wound her, though beside him Lady Portia, thinner than Arabella remembered, her mouth set in lines of permanent dissatisfaction, watched with eyes that glittered with barely concealed malice. "I must confess," Marcus continued, his tone carrying that particular condescension she remembered so well, "we had quite despaired of seeing you in society again after your retirement to the country, and now to find you so magnificently elevated, the Duke is to be congratulated on his charitable nature." The silence that followed his words seemed to crystallize the air itself, and Arabella felt rather than saw the nearby guests lean closer, anticipating her humiliation, but before she could summon a response, Sebastian spoke, his voice carrying with perfect clarity across the suddenly quiet corner of the ballroom. "I find it curious, Ashworth, that you speak of charity when describing my marriage to a woman of superior intelligence, genuine kindness, and impeccable dignity, qualities which, I am given to understand, you once had the opportunity to secure for yourself, and instead discarded in favor of a fortune that has since, by all accounts, slipped entirely through your fingers at the gaming tables." Marcus's face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, and Sebastian continued with devastating calm. "My Duchess required no elevation. She has always possessed more worth in her smallest gesture than some possess in their entire character, and the only mystery is how a man could have been foolish enough to fail to recognize it, though I confess I am grateful for that failure, as it permitted me the extraordinary fortune of claiming what you were too blind to value." The words hung in the air like a sword stroke, and Marcus, stammering, flushed, utterly diminished, retreated with Portia in tow, and as they departed, Arabella became aware of the changed quality of the gazes now fixed upon her, no longer pitying or contemptuous, but something else entirely, something that looked remarkably like respect. The tale of the Duke of Blackwood's devastating set-down of Lord Marcus Ashworth spread through London's drawing-rooms and gentlemen's clubs with the swiftness of flame through dry kindling, and by the following morning there was scarcely a household of consequence that had not heard some version of the exchange, embellished, no doubt, in the retelling. Though Arabella suspected no embellishment could improve upon the precise, surgical cruelty of Sebastian's actual words, delivered with such aristocratic composure that Marcus had been left with no possible response save retreat. Invitations began arriving at Blackwood House in such quantities that the silver tray in the entrance hall overflowed onto a secondary table Hostesses who had previously regarded the new Duchess with skeptical curiosity, now professing themselves delighted at the prospect of her attendance, their notes effusive with compliments that rang hollow to Arabella's ears, for she understood perfectly well that society's approval was as fickle as spring weather, and twice as unreliable. These same people would have whispered behind their fans about her unsuitability, had Sebastian not made his position so devastatingly clear. Yet she found she cared remarkably little for society's newly warm regard, for what occupied her thoughts as she sat in the carriage returning from the Worthington ball was not the vindication she had imagined wanting for 2 long years, not the satisfaction of seeing Marcus reduced to stammering retreat, not even the peculiar pleasure of watching Lady Portia's bitter face as she witnessed her husband's humiliation. No, what consumed Arabella's mind entirely was the memory of Sebastian's voice as he spoke, the controlled fury beneath his measured words, the way his hand had found hers and gripped it with a pressure that spoke of emotion far exceeding the cool disdain of his expression, and most particularly the almost imperceptible tremor she had felt in his fingers afterward, as though the encounter had cost him something he had not anticipated spending. The carriage was dark, the streets of London passing unseen beyond the windows, and in that intimate darkness Arabella turned to him and spoke the only words that seemed adequate. "Thank you." Sebastian was silent for a long moment, his profile barely visible in the occasional wash of lamplight from passing street corners, and when he finally spoke, his voice held none of its usual careful neutrality. Something rougher lurked beneath the surface, something that made her breath catch in her chest. "I merely spoke truth," he said, and though the words themselves were dismissive, his tone was not. Ashworth discarded a treasure in pursuit of fool's gold, and the evidence of his foolishness is written in every line of his wife's unhappy face, and every rumor of his mounting debts. I stated only what any observer with functioning eyes might perceive. He paused, and when he continued, his voice had dropped lower still, carrying a weight that pressed against Arabella's heart. "And watching you suffer society's cruelty, watching them whisper and smirk and reduce you to the object of their pity when you deserved nothing but admiration, was never something I could witness in silence again." The word again hung between them in the darkness, laden with meaning she did not fully understand, but felt in her very bones, and she knew with sudden, startling certainty that this man, who had offered her a practical arrangement, who had claimed to want nothing but partnership, who had built walls around himself as surely as she had built her own, this man was not nearly so indifferent as he pretended. The silence in the carriage stretched between them like a living thing, and Arabella found herself holding her breath, aware that they stood upon the precipice of something significant, something that could not be unspoken once given voice, and yet she could not let the moment pass without understanding what shadows moved behind his careful words. "Again," she said softly, and the single word seemed to fill the darkness with all the questions she dared not ask more directly. "You said you could not witness it again, Sebastian. What did you mean?" She heard rather than saw his sharp intake of breath, felt the subtle shift of his body on the seat beside her, as though he might retreat from the question, and for a long moment she thought he would deflect, as he always did, turning aside inquiry with cool precision or dismissive brevity, but instead he spoke, and his voice carried a rawness she had never heard from him before. "I was 22, he began, the words emerging slowly, reluctantly, as though each one cost him something precious, "and I believed myself in love with a woman I had known since childhood, Lady Eleanor Vance, daughter of my father's closest friend, and I was foolish enough to imagine that our connection was genuine, that she saw the man beneath the title and the fortune, that when she smiled at me it was Sebastian she smiled upon and not the Duke of Blackwood. His laugh was bitter, entirely devoid of humour. I proposed to her in the garden at Blackwood Hall, in the very spot where the roses bloom in summer, and she accepted with such apparent joy that I believed my happiness complete, but I learned, quite by accident, that she had been instructed by her mother to secure my affections at any cost, that she had spoken to her friends of how tedious she found my company, but how necessary it was to endure it for the sake of the dukedom, that she had laughed at my earnest declarations and called me a solemn fool too easily manipulated by a pretty face and false sentiment. Arabella's heart clenched at the pain beneath his measured recitation, at the image of a younger Sebastian, perhaps less guarded, more hopeful, discovering that his trust had been so thoroughly betrayed. "I ended the engagement," he continued, and society whispered that I had been cruel to her, that I was cold and unfeeling, and I let them believe it because the alternative was admitting that I had been made a fool, that I had offered my heart to someone who viewed it as merely a means to an end, and I swore then that I would never again permit sentiment to cloud my judgment, that I would approach marriage as the practical matter it ought to be, with clear expectations and no illusions to be shattered. He turned toward her then, and though she could barely see his features in the darkness, she felt the intensity of his gaze like a physical touch. "But you, Arabella, you have become something I did not anticipate, something I do not entirely know how to comprehend, and I find that all my careful walls seem to crumble when you are near, and I am not certain whether to be grateful or terrified." The confession hung between them, raw and unfinished, and Arabella understood at last. He was not cold but scarred, not unfeeling but so deeply feeling that he had learned to bury it beneath layers of ducal reserve, and her own carefully constructed defenses cracked beyond repair at the recognition that they were, perhaps, more alike than either had imagined. The days that followed their midnight confession in the carriage passed in a curious suspension, as though both Arabella and Sebastian required time to absorb the magnitude of what had been revealed between them, and though their interactions maintained their surface courtesy breakfast conversations about the day's engagements, evening discussions of correspondence received, there existed now an undercurrent of awareness that transformed even the most mundane exchange into something charged with unspoken significance, until finally, on an afternoon when grey London rain streaked the windows of Blackwood House and the fire crackled in the library hearth, Sebastian appeared in the doorway where Arabella sat reading and asked, in a voice that held none of its usual commanding certainty, whether she might sit with him for a moment, and something in his expression, a vulnerability she had glimpsed only in fragments before, made her set aside her book immediately and follow him to the settee by the fire, where he sat beside her rather than in his customary chair, opposite, close enough that she could see the slight tension in his jaw, the way his hands, those elegant, capable hands that managed vast estates and signed documents of consequence, fidgeted with the spine of a book he had carried with him, but clearly had no intention of reading. "I find myself," he began, then stopped, releasing a breath that sounded almost like frustration, "in the uncomfortable position of needing to express something for which I have no adequate vocabulary. Having spent the better part of a decade ensuring I would never need to attempt such expression, I am not skilled at matters of the heart, Arabella, and I fear whatever words I manage will prove insufficient to the task, yet I cannot, in good conscience, remain silent any longer, for you deserve truth, and truth is the foundation upon which I proposed we build this marriage." He turned to face her then, his grey eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, and she saw there something she had never expected to witness in the Duke of Blackwood's carefully composed features. Fear, raw and unguarded, as though he stood upon a precipice and was uncertain whether the next step would find solid ground or empty air. "What began as arrangement," he continued, his voice dropping lower, rougher, "has become something I cannot adequately name without feeling foolish. I find that your happiness has become more important to me than my own, that I think of you constantly, that the sound of your laughter has become the measure by which I judge whether a day has been well spent, and I know, with a certainty that terrifies me that I love you, though the knowing carries with it the understanding that I have given you power to destroy me as completely as Eleanor once attempted, and perhaps more successfully, for what I feel for you bears no resemblance to that youthful infatuation I once mistook for love." He reached for her hand, his fingers trembling almost imperceptibly as they closed around hers. "I ask nothing in return, I make no demands upon your heart, for I know the wounds you carry and I would not add to them by burdening you with obligation. I simply needed you to know, needed to speak this truth aloud before it consumed me entirely, and whatever you choose to do with this knowledge, I will accept, for loving you has already given me more than I ever expected to find." The tears that slipped down Arabella's cheeks were not tears of sorrow, but of something far more overwhelming, a release of every carefully hoarded fear, every midnight conviction that she was unworthy of genuine love, every wall she had constructed in the desperate hope of protecting herself from further devastation, and she did not attempt to hide them from him, did not turn away or compose herself as propriety might demand, because she understood now that Sebastian had offered her his deepest vulnerability, had laid bare the wounds he had carried in silence for a decade, and he deserved nothing less than her complete and honest truth in return. "I fought against this," she whispered, her voice trembling with the magnitude of what she was about to confess. "With every weapon my wounded heart possessed, I told myself that what I felt was gratitude, mere appreciation for your kindness and protection, that I was confusing security with affection, comfort with love. I reminded myself daily of Marcus, of how thoroughly I had been deceived before, of how my judgment had proven so catastrophically flawed that I could never trust my own heart again, and yet, despite every argument, every warning I issued to myself in the quiet hours of the night, I found that my heart refused to listen, refused to remain safely behind the walls I had so carefully constructed. Because you, Sebastian, you with your stern silences and hidden generosities, your patient kindnesses and fierce protections, you dismantled every defense I possessed, simply by being exactly who you are." She reached up to touch his face, her fingers brushing along the sharp line of his jaw, marveling at the way his breath caught at her touch, at the way this powerful, formidable man trembled beneath her gentle exploration, as though her approval meant more than all the wealth and consequence he commanded. "I love you," she said, and the words felt like freedom, like the first full breath after years of drowning. Completely, terrifyingly, wonderfully. "I love your serious eyes and your rare smiles, your devotion to duty and your hidden tenderness, the way you listen when I speak, as though my thoughts carry genuine weight, the way you defended me before all of London without hesitation or calculation. I love you, Sebastian, and the loving feels like coming home to a place I never knew existed." The kiss that followed began as something tender, almost reverent, his lips meeting hers with a gentleness that spoke of precious things carefully handled, but it deepened swiftly into something consuming, years of suppressed longing and newly acknowledged love, finding expression in the press of mouths and the tangle of fingers in hair, and when they finally drew apart, both breathless, his forehead resting against hers, Arabella saw in his grey eyes a wonder that matched her own. That night, when Sebastian appeared at her chamber door, he carried no assumption of welcome, only a question in his eyes that she answered by taking his hand and drawing him across the threshold, and their union was everything she had never dared hope for, gentle, where gentleness was needed, passionate, where passion demanded expression, a physical manifestation of the emotional truth they had finally spoken aloud, and afterward, wrapped in his arms with his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, and his fingers tracing lazy patterns along her spine, Arabella felt something she had believed lost to her forever, wholeness, complete and radiant, as though every broken piece of her heart had been gathered and reformed into something stronger and more beautiful than before. The remainder of the London season unfolded like a dream from which Arabella feared she might wake, for the transformation in her circumstances, and in the manner with which society regarded her, seemed almost too complete to be believed. Yet believe it she must, for the evidence presented itself at every ball and soirée, every afternoon call and evening entertainment, in the form of invitations that arrived by the dozens at Blackwood House, in the suddenly warm greetings of hostesses who had once looked through her as though she were invisible, and most remarkably of all, in the undisguised devotion of the man who had become not merely her husband in name, but the very centre of her existence. The Duke of Blackwood, once notorious for his stern demeanour and utter disinterest in social pleasantries, had become the subject of breathless gossip of an entirely different nature, for society could speak of nothing but the way he watched his Duchess across crowded ballrooms with an expression that transformed his severe features into something approaching tenderness, the way he declined every invitation to dance with simpering debutantes or ambitious widows, with the simple statement that his dance card belonged entirely to his wife, the way he had commissioned the most celebrated portrait artist in London to capture her likeness for the Grand Gallery at Blackwood Hall, a commission that spoke more loudly than any declaration of the value he placed upon her. Arabella observed Lady Portia Ashworth at the Henderson Musicale, noting with something that was not quite satisfaction but perhaps a distant cousin to it, the bitter lines that had etched themselves around the woman's mouth, the desperate quality of her forced laughter, the way her eyes followed her husband Marcus, whose gambling had apparently worsened considerably since their marriage, with an expression of weary contempt rather than wifely affection. and though Arabella took no pleasure in another woman's unhappiness, she could not help but recognize the poetic justice in the contrast between her own flourishing union and the misery of those who had once conspired in her humiliation. The Dowager Duchess, during one of their now frequent visits, surveyed Arabella with those sharp, knowing eyes and pronounced herself adequately satisfied with her grandson's choice before adding, with characteristic directness, that she expected to hear news of great-grandchildren before the year was out, a comment that brought heat to Arabella's cheeks and a rare, full smile to Sebastian's face. Catherine's debut proved a triumphant success, for the sponsorship of the Duchess of Blackwood combined with the substantial dowry Sebastian had quietly settled upon her attracted suitors of genuine quality, and Arabella found joy she had not anticipated in guiding her sister through the complexities of society with the protection and consequence she herself had once lacked. The Thornwood debts existed now only as a distant memory, her parents secured in comfort, every practical concern that had once weighed upon her shoulders lifted by Sebastian's quiet generosity. Yet these material blessings paled beside the greater miracle that every public appearance, every dance in her husband's arms, every moment his hand found hers beneath the table at formal dinners, confirmed what she still sometimes struggled to believe entirely, that she was cherished, elevated, and genuinely, completely loved. 5 years had passed since that London season when everything had changed. 5 years that had transformed Blackwood Hall from a magnificent but solemn estate into a home, alive with warmth and laughter, and the particular chaos that only children can bring. And on this golden autumn afternoon, with the gardens ablaze in shades of amber and crimson that reminded Arabella achingly of those first tentative days of her marriage, she sat upon the stone bench where she had once begged Sebastian not to marry her and watched their son, Edward, 3 years old, serious and dark-haired, with his father's grey eyes and already his father's habit of studying the world with solemn intensity before pronouncing judgment, attempt to explain to his baby sister the proper way to examine a fallen leaf, while Rose, barely 10 months old and fair as morning sunlight, gurgled happily in her nurse's arms and reached for her brother's hair instead of the botanical specimen he offered. The transformation in Sebastian still caught Arabella by surprise at unexpected moments, the way this man who had once been called the coldest duke in England now crawled upon nursery floors to build towers of blocks only so Edward could, knock them down with delighted shrieks, the way he sang off-key lullabies to Rose when he thought no one was listening, the way his stern features softened into something approaching wonder each time one of his children reached for him, as though he could not quite believe that such small, perfect beings were truly his to love and protect. Their marriage had not merely survived the transition from passionate revelation to domestic reality. It had deepened in ways Arabella could not have imagined during those early, uncertain days, each year bringing greater intimacy, more profound trust, a joy that felt both steady as stone and fresh as each new morning. And she had learned that love was not a destination to be reached, but a garden to be tended, requiring daily attention, small kindnesses, forgiveness of minor irritations, and the willingness to choose each other again and again across the ordinary moments that comprised a life. The Dowager Duchess had lived to see Edward's christening, had held her great-grandson in arms that trembled with age and emotion, and had pronounced him acceptable, which from her had been the highest possible praise, before passing peacefully in her sleep 3 months later, with the expression of contentment upon her weathered face, and Sebastian's hand clasped in her own. Catherine had married the Earl of Worthington, a kind man who adored her completely, and visited often with her own growing brood, filling Blackwood Hall with even more delightful chaos during the holidays. Arabella's parents lived comfortably in the dower house on the estate, her mother's health much improved, her father's gambling days long behind him, their gratitude expressed in quieter ways than words. When Sebastian emerged from the house and crossed the garden toward her, Arabella's heart still performed that peculiar flutter it had learned during their first season together, and when he settled beside her on the bench, his thigh warm against hers, and told her that choosing her remained the wisest decision of his entire life, she leaned into him and knew with bone-deep certainty that the wounded girl who had once stood humiliated in a ballroom had found something infinitely more precious than she had ever lost. Arabella watched Edward toddle after a butterfly that had no intention of being caught, Rose now drowsing contentedly against her shoulder, and allowed her thoughts to wander back through the strange and winding path that had led her to this moment of perfect contentment, back to that devastating night at the Devonshire ball, when she had stood frozen in humiliation as Marcus announced his engagement to another, when the pitying glances of society had felt like physical blows, and she had been certain, absolutely certain, that she would never recover from such public destruction of her hopes and dignity, and she marveled now at how wrong she had been, not about the pain, for that had been real and lasting, but about what recovery might look like, for she had imagined it would mean hardening herself against feeling, armoring her heart so thoroughly that nothing could ever wound her again, when in truth the healing had come not from closing herself off, but from allowing herself, terrified though she had been, to open once more. She had believed, in those dark days of her social exile, that love required the grand gestures and passionate declarations she had read about in novels, that it announced itself with thunderclaps and swept one away on torrents of overwhelming emotion. But she had learned instead that truest love often arrived quietly, through consistent kindness that asked nothing in return, through steady presence in moments both significant and mundane, through actions that spoke when words proved insufficient, through the patient dismantling of walls built by wounded hearts who had forgotten they were capable of trust. She had nearly refused this happiness out of fear, had stood before Sebastian in that garden and begged him not to marry her, so certain that she offered nothing worth wanting, so convinced that her damage rendered her unsuitable for any man of worth, let alone a duke whose consequence could have commanded any bride in England, and the memory of her own desperate protests brought a soft smile to her lips now, for she understood at last what Sebastian had seen when he looked at her, not damaged goods to be pitied or a problem to be solved, but a woman whose wounds had become wisdom, whose guarded heart proved she understood the value of what she protected, and whose dignity in suffering revealed a strength that simpering debutantes untouched by hardship could never possess. Two broken people had built something whole together, had learned that shared scars created not weakness but understanding, that the walls they had constructed to protect themselves could be dismantled brick by careful brick when the right person proved, through patience and constancy, that vulnerability would be honored rather than exploited. To those who had journeyed with her through this tale, Arabella offered this truth from the fullness of her grateful heart. Love worth having rarely looked like expectation, rarely arrived in the form one had imagined or hoped for during girlish dreams of romance, for sometimes it came dressed as practical arrangement, as stern silence concealing depths of feeling, as unexpected grace extended by those the world deemed cold, but who burned brightest of all beneath their reserve. Sometimes the bravest thing one could do was say yes to what terrified most, yes to hope after despair, yes to openness after betrayal, yes to the possibility that happiness might be waiting just beyond the walls one had built to keep pain at bay. She thanked those who had walked beside her through the shadows and into the light, and wished for each of them their own unexpected happiness, their own stern duke with tender heart, their own journey from devastation to joy, for such journeys, she had learned, were possible for anyone brave enough to believe they deserved love and courageous enough to accept it when it arrived.